Good morning. Scripture reading for today comes from the book of Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. Once again, that's Genesis 8, 1 to 5. It reads, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month of the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen." Zane, come preach the word.
I don't know about the other guys in this series. It's a great series, but I think it's one of those that Paul put on us to see how good you really are at preparing sermons, because this one was tough. It was tough to find in Mount Ararat a lesson for us as far as the future. There's something to be said, and something that I really enjoy doing is standing at the foot of large mountains. I've had the privilege of hiking and walking on El Capitan in California and in the Torres del Paine in southern Chile. And there's just something about that feeling of being in the presence or being at the foot or on the top of these wonderful mountains that encourage you or that lift your spirit. Even so much so that in our spiritual conversations, we talk about these mountaintop experiences and these spiritual highs and these spiritual moments in our lives where we get to enjoy God's presence on the mountain. It's a place we can finally breathe and relax and be in God's presence. So our story this morning begins in Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And it talks about the flood. And it talks about how the ark began to rest upon Mount Ararat. If we look at this, we see that in this process that Moses has spent 150 days in the ark. But somewhere along the way, in that end of that process, we find, in the text says that it rested on the mountains of Ararat. I don't know for certain that that's on the mountain of Ararat. I don't know if it's in the surrounding areas of Mount Ararat or in the shadows of Mount Ararat. But we do know that Mount Ararat is important in the story. And it took me a long time to figure out how to put it in the story and what was the major component of that. And then I realized that Mount Ararat just sits right in the middle of the story. And so what we see in this mountain in eastern Turkey is where Noah is not worried about geography. He's a moment of God's faithfulness in the storm. But Mount Ararat's not at the beginning of the story, and it's not at the end of the story. But it's a moment in trusting, in the culmination of the trusting of Noah in God. Noah had to wait on God's timing. Mount Ararat was the beginning of that process. And so what I've come to look at in this text is I want to give you just 3 things that we can see from Mount Ararat and what we can use in our lives that will help us walk through the storms of life. The first one is that Mount Ararat is a place of rest after the storm. We see that in this process, and we need to understand that what's going on in Noah's life at this moment, because not only has he been in the ark for 150 days, he's been trying to build the ark for over 100 years. And so he's been trying in this difficulty and the storm and the challenges of life. Now he finds a moment of peace and calm. I would assume in that process when it begins to rest, it begins to be a time of peace and calm from the storm. Noah begins to experience some stability in the ark because it begins to be a process where the waters are receding and it's just kind of setting and resting and hovering in that area. But there's something interesting about the story is that in this part of the story, there's nothing that Noah has done. If we look back from the beginning, God told him to build an ark. He told him to get on the ark. We know that God closed the ark. God brought the rain. God wiped out the people off of the face of the earth. And what is Noah done? He's just been. He's just there. And so we see that the ark the Mount Ararat in this is the time where God or Noah begins or continues to trust in God. We know that they've come to this point of Mount Ararat not because of not because of Noah's great ability as a sailor, because he was a farmer. So he didn't know how to do this. Even some believe that the ark, the shape of the ark, was more like a box, and God carried it to that point. But wherever we find ourselves in the middle of the storm, the point of rest is because God has worked from the beginning till now to get him there. The protection from the storm, the rest in the storm is all about God's working in Noah's life. It's not about Noah. So when we find ourselves in the middle of the storm, we don't have any control. We need to know that God is at work in the storm. God knows when it's enough. God knows where you are, and God knows where he's bringing you to. Sometimes God will park us in certain spots, allowing us to rest before moving forward. It's almost like being on an airplane with a lot of turbulence. And you land, and that taxi to the gate is a moment of rest before you get on and continue your journey. That's the way Mount Ararat appears to me in this story. It's that moment of rest. And so like we see the first thing we remember about Mount Ararat is it is the place of rest in the storm. The second thing we see that Mount Ararat is so important is because just because the ark began to rest on Mount Ararat doesn't mean that Noah's time of waiting was over. It actually says in the text that Noah still waited almost 2 months before getting off the ark. It says he waited a little over a month to even before he opened the door or opened the window to be able to see out. So sometimes we see in this process, like we do in the eyes of the life of Noah, is that our rest doesn't mean that we're done waiting on the Lord. So we need to learn to process the waiting for God. But what's interesting in that process of waiting on God, when he opens the ark, it says in verse 5 that he had already seen the tops of the mountains. But even seeing the gold, it was still not time for him to go to work. Even seeing the mission, it was still not time for him to go to work because the earth was not ready for him to step off. And so we see that God's promises are perfect. They're certain. His protection is constant. His provision is continual. But his timing is his timing, not ours. So it took 100 years for the flood to get there. It took 40 days for the rains to stop. It took about 10 months for the boat to begin to rest. It still took another 2 months for it to be dry land. Sometimes when we find rest, we get too eager to begin the next journey. So let us not confuse the mountain sightings for the mission to get started. Let's wait for God's timing. Waiting on God is the key, even though it's hard. But waiting on God is the thing that will allow us to be ready when he does open the door for us to get off the ark. It's like a little boy who helps his mother bake cookies. And they come out of the oven, and she sets them on the counter, and he says, Mom, can I have one? And she says, let them cool. And in his eagerness, he waits all of 4 or 5 seconds, picks up one and bites it, and he burns his mouth. And he complains to his mother, why didn't you tell me they were hot? And she said, I did. But you didn't wait long enough. So we see in Mount Ararat, rest has come after the storm. But we also see that sometimes our waiting needs to continue until God is ready for us to come out of the ark. The third thing we see is that Mount Ararat, not being at the end of the story, but being in the middle of the story, becomes the launching point of where God is going to do great things through Noah. God is going to begin to bless the earth again. And as a matter of fact, as you see that, after all this time in the ark, and after God finally sets it down on the dry land, we see that Noah has gone through the sending out the raven, sending out the dove, and finally the time has come. But even when the time is ready, God opens the door and calls him out. And Noah unloads the ark. And the first thing that Noah does is he worships. And he worships. In his worship of God after the storm and after the rest, it says that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and says, I will never again destroy mankind. Coming out of the storm, our first response needs to be worship. Coming out of the rest, our first response needs to be praise. But what's so interesting in this story to me is Mount Ararat is not the symbol or not the sign of the new covenant that he's bringing with Noah and the world. Mount Ararat was just the launching point toward that. It was just where it was going to start. And from there on, the sign would be the rainbow in the sky, which God would remember to never destroy again his people or the people of the world. So when God delivers you, your first step should be in worship and relief, not just relief. New beginnings are built on altars of praise, not our plans. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. It says that God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. It was only a few people, 8, in which were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removing of dirt from the body, but for the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with the angels, authorities, and powers in his submission. The mountain is the launching point for our future. Can you see that in our spiritual walk as well? The mountain is the launching point of our future. And standing on the empty cross or standing in the open tomb is the sign of what God has promised he will do. We are now God's handiwork, created by Jesus Christ to do good, which is prepared in advance for us to do. So our salvation, Noah's salvation is about the craftsmanship that God will use to do good works. So we see 3 things about the mountain. The first one, it's a rest in a storm. The second one is that we need to learn to wait on God's timing. And the third one is that from the mountain is where God will eventually begin to use us because he is faithful. So you might ask, how do I get the mountaintop experience? I mean, because if that's what it's about, how do I get the mountaintop experience? Well, I'm here to tell you that you can't do anything. Hebrews 11, verse 7 says, By faith, Noah, who when warned about the things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save him, or to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became the heir of the righteousness that keeps with faith. If you want the mountaintop experiences, if you want that part of your life, the thing that we do is absolutely nothing because we trust in God. We begin to live a life of courageous and bold faith, and that will get us to the mountaintop. Well, that will get God taking us to the mountaintop. So there's two things that I want to leave you with as far as how you get there. Because we see that bold and courageous faith in the life of Noah looks like this. The first thing we see in Noah's life is it's a radical obedience that goes against the grain or goes against the current. The Lord told Noah to build an ark. It was not only a command, it was a stay the course. Because when God comes down looking at the evil of the world and he sees Noah in his faithfulness, in his righteousness, him coming to tell him to build the ark is saying to Noah, keep the walk, keep the faith, keep going the route you're going. It wasn't turning him away from what he was already doing. It's asking him to continue and to move forward. And so God tells Noah, but he uses other words because he talks about build an ark. But he says, I want you to stay the course. In all the evilness of the world, God wants Noah to stay the course. I want you to keep looking for my favor. I want you to keep walking in righteousness and holiness. I want you to keep going even though it may be lonely and difficult. And I want you to continue to search for me and do what you need to do to find favor with me. Stay the course. So a bold faith is one that stays the course. Mount Ararat is experienced when we faithfully go against the current and remain faithful to God, and he will use us. The second thing is that Noah invested in a future that most people didn't believe in. If you look at the life of Noah, he was asked to build an ark. They never knew rain. They never knew about arks. They never knew about anything else. And Noah still begins by cutting down one tree to build an ark. But what's even more impressive about Noah's faith is that 100 years later, he's still cutting down trees and building an ark. And he's never seen rain. He's never seen flood. He doesn't even know if it's going to float. So when we look at faith, when we look at the mountain of Ararat, we look at this idea, God says, believe in a future that nobody else believes. And what is that future? A relationship with him. The people around Noah didn't believe in God's judgment. They didn't believe in a flood. But Noah did, and he worked mightily to be able to invest in that future. So summing it up, Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat teaches us that God steers us in the storm and gives us a place to rest. Mount Ararat teaches that God's timing sometimes requires us to wait on him. Most times it requires us to wait on him because he's at work. Mount Ararat says that God's future, or God relationship with God, invests in a future that is a new beginning for the rest of your life. And God's people live by a bold faith. So if you're still building your ark, obey courageously his plan. If you're still in your flood, trust in his steering. If you're resting on the mountaintop, don't rush ahead, believe in his timing. Walking out the door, step out in worship and obedience and hold fast to the covenant. Because that's Mount Ararat. To sum it all up, but I want you to see the importance of this passage. It starts with one verse, and it says, and God remembered Noah. It's not that God forgot about him. It's about that God decided to act upon his covenant that he had made and was making with Noah of care. So Mount Ararat stands as a reminder of all those things. But Mount Ararat stands as a reminder that God will not forget you. God remembers you in your storm. God remembers you in your waiting. And God remembers you in your faith. So when it feels like heaven is silent, remember, the Spirit is God's guarantee that he will give us the inheritance he promised us, that he has purchased us to be his own people. Mount Ararat is because God remembers.